The storm came out of the Black Hills like the wrath of God himself, turning the South Dakota sky from blue to black in the span of minutes. Josiah Blackwood stood on his porch, watching the wall of darkness race across the prairie toward his ranch, and knew with the certainty of a man who'd lived through enough disasters that this one would be different. This one would take everything. He'd seen storms before in his 47 years, seen tornadoes dance across the plains like devils, seen hail the size of chicken eggs destroy a year's wheat in minutes. But this thing approaching had a malevolence to it, a purposeful destruction that made the hair on his arms stand up. The wind arrived first, not gradually but all at once, slamming into the ranch buildings like a physical force. Josiah ran for the barn where his horses were stabled. If he could get them out, maybe they'd have a chance. But he'd barely made it halfway when the full fury of the storm hit. The wind knocked him flat, driving dirt and debris into his eyes and mouth. He crawled the rest of the way, fighting for every inch. The barn doors were already being torn from their hinges when he reached them. Inside, the horses screamed in terror, rearing and kicking at their stalls. Josiah managed to open 2 stalls before a piece of the roof tore away with a sound like the world ending. Rain began driving in sideways, so hard it felt like buckshot against his skin. Then came the lightning, not the occasional flash he was used to, but a constant barrage that turned night into stuttering day. One bolt hit the barn's cupola, and Josiah watched in horror as fire began to spread despite the driving rain. The horses he'd freed bolted into the storm, the ones still trapped. Their screams would haunt him forever. He tried to save them. God knows he tried. But the barn was coming apart around him, beams falling, walls caving in. A flying plank caught him across the temple, and the world went grey. The last thing he remembered was crawling out of the inferno, the taste of smoke and failure in his mouth. When Josiah woke, the storm was gone, and so was everything else. His ranch, built with 15 years of sweat and sacrifice, was scattered across 3 counties. The barn was a blackened skeleton. The house had simply vanished, foundation and all, as if plucked from the earth by a giant hand. Of his 12 horses, he found 3 alive, wandering dazed among the wreckage. The rest lay twisted and broken where the storm had flung them. His cattle were gone. 400 head, representing his life savings, had either been killed or scattered so far they might as well be dead. The fences that had contained them were tangled wire and splintered posts pointing in all directions. His tools, his stored grain, his winter supplies, all gone. Josiah sat in what had been his front yard, now just another piece of indistinguishable prairie, and laughed. It was not a sane sound. 15 years of work, destroyed in 15 minutes. He'd already been alone. His wife Sarah had died in childbirth 8 years back, taking their son with her. He'd thrown himself into the ranch after that, making it his whole world. Now that world was gone too. For 3 days he camped in the ruins, salvaging what little he could. A few tools, some canned goods from what had been his root cellar. His father's rifle, miraculously intact in its case. The 3 surviving horses, 2 mares and a gelding, regarded him with traumatized eyes that probably mirrored his own. On the 4th day, reality set in. He had no money to rebuild. The cattle that had been his cash crop were gone. The approaching winter would kill him if he stayed here with no shelter. His nearest neighbor was 20 miles away, and pride wouldn't let him go begging for help. He'd always been self-sufficient, proud of needing no one. Now that independence had become a trap. Josiah loaded what supplies he had onto the gelding and saddled one of the mares. The other mare he'd have to leave to fend for herself. He couldn't care for 3 horses with no shelter or feed. He murmured an apology to her as he mounted up, then turned his back on the ruins of his life and headed west. Where he didn't know. Away was all that mattered. For a week he drifted, following old cattle trails and creek beds. He avoided towns, avoided people. What was there to say? That he'd been a successful rancher until God decided otherwise? That everything he'd touched turned to ash? He ate sparingly from his meager supplies, supplementing with whatever game he could shoot. At night he lay under the stars, not bothering with a fire, almost hoping the cold would take him. It was beside Crow Creek that his horse went lame. The mare had been favoring her right front leg for a day, and when Josiah finally stopped to check, he found a festering cut, probably from storm debris. Infection had set in. In town, with proper care, She might recover. Out here, she was finished. Josiah sat by the creek holding the rifle, knowing what had to be done but unable to do it. The mare had been Sarah's favorite, one of the last links to happier times. To kill her felt like killing the last of his memories. That's when he heard the wagon. It appeared around a bend in the creek trail, pulled by two sturdy mules. The driver was a woman, alone, which was unusual enough to penetrate Josiah's despair. Women didn't travel alone in this country, not if they had any sense. She was perhaps 35, with dark hair streaked with premature gray pulled back in a practical bun. Her clothes were plain but clean, and she handled the mules with easy competence. She pulled up near him, studying the scene. The lame horse, the loaded pack animal, the man sitting with a rifle across his knees, looking like death, warmed over. "Horse is lame," she said. It wasn't a question. Josiah nodded, not trusting his voice. "Infection's too far gone," she continued, dismounting to examine the mare. "She's suffering." "I know," Josiah managed. The woman looked at him with eyes that seemed older than her face. "But you can't do it, because she's all you have left of someone you loved." Josiah stared at her. "How could you know that?" "I recognize the look," she said simply. "May I?" She held out her hand for the rifle. Josiah hesitated, then handed it over. The woman spoke softly to the mare, stroking her neck, then led her a little distance away. The shot, when it came, was clean and merciful. The mare dropped instantly, without pain. The woman returned the rifle and went to her wagon, pulling out a shovel. "Ground's too hard here for a proper burial, but we can at least cover her with stones. Keep the scavengers off." They worked together in silence, building a cairn over the mare's body. When it was done, Josiah found his voice. "Thank you, I couldn't." "Sometimes we need someone else to do what we can't," the woman said. "Where are you headed?" "Nowhere," Josiah said. "Anywhere, away from what used to be my ranch." "The storm." When he nodded, she said, "It hit a lot of folks hard. Town of Millbrook got wiped clean off the map. Hundreds dead or missing." "I didn't know," Josiah said. He'd been so lost in his own tragedy, he hadn't considered others might have suffered too. "I'm headed to what's left of Millbrook," the woman said. "Got medical supplies in the wagon. I'm a nurse, or was, back east. Came out here for my own reasons. Name's Catherine Chen." The name registered dimly with Josiah. "Chen? That's Chinese, yes, my husband was. I kept his name after he died." Her tone discouraged further questions. "Josiah Blackwood," he offered. "Well, Mr. Blackwood, you look like a man who could use a purpose. I could use help in Millbrook. Another pair of hands, someone strong enough to dig through rubble and move the injured. I can't pay, but I can offer food and a reason to keep going." "Why would you trust a stranger?" Josiah asked. Catherine smiled, and it transformed her plain features. "Because you couldn't shoot a suffering animal. That tells me what I need to know about your heart. And because," she paused, "because I recognize someone who's lost everything. I've been there. Sometimes helping others is the only way back." Josiah looked at his remaining horses, at his meager possessions, at the cairn covering Sarah's mare. Then he looked at this strange woman offering him something he hadn't realized he needed, a purpose beyond his own survival. "All right," he said. They traveled together toward Millbrook, Josiah riding alongside the wagon. Catherine told him her story as they went. She'd been a nurse in San Francisco, married to a Chinese doctor. They'd faced prejudice and violence, but they'd been happy. Then came the riot. Her husband had been beaten to death by a mob while she watched, helpless. She'd fled California, drifting east, using her skills where needed but never settling. "The frontier doesn't care where you're from if you can set a broken bone or deliver a baby," she said. "I've been traveling for 3 years now, going where I'm needed." "Don't you ever want to settle down, find a home?" Josiah asked. "Home was a person, not a place," Catherine said. "When he died, I lost that. Now," she shrugged, "now I make myself useful. It's enough." They smelled Millbrook before they saw it. The stench of death and destruction carried on the wind. When they crested the last hill, Josiah pulled up short. Where a thriving town of 800 souls had stood, there was now only devastation. Buildings were reduced to splinters, Debris was scattered for miles. Survivors moved among the ruins like ghosts. "Dear God," Josiah breathed. "God had nothing to do with this," Catherine said grimly. "Come on, they need us." The next weeks blurred together in a haze of exhaustion and horror. They set up Catherine's supplies in one of the few buildings still partially standing. The bank's vault had protected it somewhat. Survivors came in a steady stream. Broken bones, infected wounds, typhoid from contaminated water, children orphaned and adults driven mad by loss. Josiah threw himself into the work with a fervor that surprised him. He dug through rubble, searching for survivors and too often finding only bodies. He helped build temporary shelters, distributed food and water, held down patients while Catherine set bones or cleaned wounds. His size and strength made him invaluable, but it was his gentleness with the traumatized that Catherine noticed most. "You're good with them," she said one evening as they took a rare break. They were sitting outside the makeshift hospital, sharing a pot of coffee. "I know what they're feeling," Josiah said. "The disbelief, the anger, the wondering why them, why now, what they did to deserve it." "And what did you conclude about deserving it?" Josiah was quiet for a long moment. "That it doesn't matter. Deserve's got nothing to do with it. Storms come, people die. The only question is what you do after." Catherine nodded approvingly. "That's wisdom hard-earned." As the weeks turned to months, Josiah found himself changing. The work was hard, heartbreaking at times, but it filled the hollow place inside him. He was needed. His strength, his steadiness, his very presence made a difference. Children who'd lost everything clung to him. Men who'd lost their nerve found courage in his example. Women who'd lost their husbands felt safer with him around. And always there was Catherine, tireless and competent, treating each patient with the same careful attention whether they were white, black, Indian or Chinese. She faced down anyone who objected to her treating their kind. And after Josiah stood behind her a few times, his hand resting on his rifle, the objections stopped. They made a good team. Where she was skilled, he was strong. Where he was uncertain, she was confident. They developed a rhythm, anticipating each other's needs, communicating without words. It reminded him of working with Sarah, that easy partnership, though he pushed the comparison away. Winter came early and hard. The temporary shelters weren't enough, and people began dying from exposure. That's when Jacob Morrison showed up. Morrison was a land speculator, the kind who profited from others' misfortune. He'd bought up the deeds of dead homesteaders for pennies on the dollar and now owned half the county. "I've got a proposition," Morrison announced at a town meeting. "I'll provide lumber and supplies to build proper shelters. In exchange, those of you who lost your claims, sign them over to me. Fair compensation for your worthless land." "That's not fair compensation," Josiah said, standing up. "That's theft." Morrison's eyes narrowed. "And who are you to say? You're not even from here." "He's the man who's been pulling your neighbors from the rubble while you've been counting your profits," Catherine said, rising to stand beside him. The crowd murmured agreement. They'd all seen Josiah working himself to exhaustion for no pay, no thanks expected. Morrison had been notably absent during the worst of it. "I'm offering help," Morrison insisted. "You're offering chains," Josiah countered. "These people sign over their land, they've got nothing left, no way to start over." "Then what do you suggest?" Morrison sneered. "Where else will they get the materials to survive winter?" Josiah thought about his father's rifle, the only valuable thing he had left, about the 2 horses that could be sold. It wasn't much, but "We'll find another way," he said. "There's timber in the hills, we'll cut it ourselves. Those who can work will help build for those who can't. No one signs away their future for a roof." "That's a fool's plan," Morrison said. "Maybe," Josiah agreed, "but it's an honest one." The crowd chose Josiah's plan. It was brutal work, cutting timber in the snow, hauling it down from the hills, building in freezing conditions. But they did it together, as a community. Josiah organized work crews, managed supplies, settled disputes. Without meaning to, he'd become a leader. Catherine worked alongside him when she wasn't tending patients. She had a surprising strength for her size, and an even more surprising vocabulary when things went wrong. They grew comfortable with each other's silence, able to work for hours without speaking. One night, exhausted after raising a cabin for a family of 5, they sat by the fire in the hospital. Most of the patients were sleeping, and for once they had a moment of peace. "You've changed," Catherine observed. "How so?" "When I met you, you were trying to die. Now you're fighting to keep others alive." Josiah considered this. "I had nothing left to lose. Turns out that's a kind of freedom. When you're not protecting anything of your own, you can risk everything for others. Is that what you're doing? Risking everything?" "What's everything?" Josiah asked. "I've got 2 horses and a rifle. You've got a wagon and medical supplies. We're both ghosts, Catherine. The storm killed me same as if it had broken my body. This," he gestured at the sleeping patients, the town they were rebuilding, "this is just what I'm doing while I haunt the world." Catherine was quiet for a long moment. "My husband used to say that in Chinese philosophy, crisis contains opportunity. The character for crisis combines danger and opportunity. Maybe that's what we are. Not ghosts, but opportunities born from crisis." "For others, maybe," Josiah said. "But for ourselves?" "I don't know," Catherine admitted. "I've been running for 3 years, using others' needs to avoid my own emptiness. But lately," she paused. "Lately? Lately I wonder if there might be more, if 2 ghosts might make each other real again." The words hung between them, fragile as frost. Josiah felt something stir in his chest, a warmth he'd thought the storm had extinguished forever. But before he could respond, one of the patients cried out, and the moment was broken. Spring came slowly to the rebuilt Millbrook. The hastily constructed buildings had held through winter, and now people began to think beyond mere survival. Gardens were planted, businesses reopened, children attended school in a repurposed barn. The town was smaller than before, scarred but surviving. Josiah had built himself a small cabin on the edge of town. Nothing fancy, just walls and a roof, but it was the first thing he'd built for himself since the storm. He'd taken a job as sheriff. The previous one had died in the storm, and people trusted Josiah to keep the peace. Catherine had moved her medical supplies into a proper building, establishing the town's first real hospital. She'd stopped talking about moving on, though she'd never formally decided to stay. It was Morrison who forced the issue. He'd never forgiven Josiah for thwarting his land grab, and as the town prospered, his resentment grew. He hired guns, hard men who caused trouble in the saloons and intimidated anyone who stood up to their boss. The confrontation came on a warm May evening. Josiah was making his rounds when he heard shouting from the hospital. He ran, finding 3 of Morrison's men surrounding Catherine, who stood protectively in front of a Chinese family she'd been treating. "We told you before," one of the men was saying. "We don't want their kind here. You treat them. You're as bad as they are." "Anyone who needs help is welcome in my hospital," Catherine said firmly, though Josiah could see her hands trembling. "Your hospital?" The man laughed. "Last I checked, this was still America. We decide who belongs." "You're right," Josiah said from the doorway. "This is America, where the law says all people are equal. As sheriff, I'm telling you to leave. Now." The men turned, hands hovering near their guns. 3 against 1, Sheriff. You sure you want to do this?" "I'm sure," Josiah said calmly. "Question is, are you sure you want to draw on a man who's got nothing left to lose?" Something in his voice, the absolute absence of fear, made them hesitate. In that hesitation, their courage broke. They filed out, muttering threats, but they left. "Thank you," Catherine said once they were gone. "Just doing my job," Josiah replied, but they both knew it was more than that. That night, Morrison's men burned the hospital. Josiah was first on the scene, helping Catherine evacuate patients. Together they fought the flames, but it was hopeless. The building was engulfed, along with most of Catherine's supplies and equipment. Years of collected medicines, irreplaceable in this frontier town, went up in smoke. Catherine stood watching her life's work burn, tears streaming down her face. "I should have known, should have been more careful. I've endangered everyone." "This isn't your fault," Josiah said fiercely. "Morrison did this. His hate, his greed." "What does it matter whose fault it is?" Catherine asked. "It's gone, all of it, just like—" She stopped. "Just like everything else we've loved," Josiah finished. "I know, But we've rebuilt before, we can do it again. Can we? Catherine turned to him and he saw the depth of her exhaustion. How many times can a person start over? How many times can you lose everything and keep going? Josiah thought about his ranch, about Sarah and their son, about everything the storm had taken. Then he thought about the months since, the people they'd helped, the town they'd rebuilt, the connection growing between them. As many times as it takes, he said. Until we get it right, or until we can't anymore, but not alone this time. Catherine looked at him, really looked at him. What are you saying? I'm saying Morrison's going to pay for this. I'm saying we're going to rebuild that hospital. And I'm saying... He took a breath. I'm saying that two ghosts might make each other real again, if they're willing to try. The arrest of Morrison and his men was swift. The town rallied behind their sheriff and their nurse. Evidence of arson was clear, and frontier justice, while rough, was decisive. Morrison lost everything: his land, his freedom, his power over others' lives. The rebuilding of the hospital became a community effort. Donations poured in from neighboring towns who'd heard of Catherine's work. A doctor in Denver sent supplies. The territorial government, embarrassed by the violence against a medical facility, provided funding. But more than the hospital was rebuilt. As Josiah and Catherine worked side by side, something new grew between them. Not a replacement for what they'd lost, nothing could be that, but something uniquely theirs. Built on shared loss, tempered by shared purpose, strengthened by the choice to keep going when stopping would have been easier. On a cool autumn evening, a year after the storm that had taken everything, Josiah stood with Catherine in front of the new hospital. It was bigger than the old one, better equipped. A symbol of what could rise from ashes when people refused to let hate and destruction have the final word. We did it, Catherine said, her hand finding his. We did a lot more than that, Josiah replied. We found a way back. Back to what? Not back, he corrected himself. Forward, to something new. They were married that winter, a simple ceremony in the hospital chapel. The whole town attended. This community built from catastrophe, bound together by shared survival and mutual aid. Josiah wore his father's suit, salvaged and mended. Catherine wore a dress sewn by the women she'd saved. In his vows, Josiah spoke of storms and rebuilding, of finding purpose in service to others, of choosing love when loss would have been easier to bear. Catherine spoke of healing that came not from medicine, but from connection, of strength found in vulnerability, of homes built not from wood and stone, but from the choice to stand together. Outside, snow began to fall, gentle and clean, covering the scars of the past year. But inside the hospital, there was warmth and light, and the quiet joy of lives intertwined by choice rather than chance. They never had children of their own, but they raised dozens in a different way, nursing them through illness, teaching them resilience, showing them that the worst storms could become the foundations for the strongest communities. The hospital grew into a teaching facility, bringing doctors and nurses to the frontier, spreading Catherine's philosophy of care without prejudice. Josiah never rebuilt his ranch, but he found his purpose in protecting and serving the town that had become his home. His size and strength, once used only for his own survival, became a shelter for others. His experience with loss became wisdom that comforted the grieving. Years later, when journalists came to write about the woman who'd revolutionized frontier medicine and the sheriff who'd helped build a town from ruins, they'd always ask about that first meeting by Crow Creek. How had two broken people found each other just when they needed it most? Catherine would smile and say it was chance, nothing more. Josiah would say it was necessity. They'd each had something the other needed. But privately, they both knew the truth. It was choice. The choice to help when helping hurt. The choice to trust when trust seemed foolish. The choice to build when everything in them wanted only to mourn what was lost. The storm had taken everything from Josiah Blackwood. But in that taking, it had cleared the ground for something new to grow. Not a replacement for what was lost, but a transformation of loss into purpose, isolation into community, despair into hope. And in the end, that transformation was the greatest gift the storm could have given, the knowledge that even in the deepest darkness, two people choosing to light a candle together could illuminate a way forward for many. The hospital still stands today, a monument not to tragedy, but to what can rise from it when human kindness refuses to be extinguished. And in the small cemetery behind it, two graves sit side by side, their headstones bearing a simple inscription: "They rebuilt more than buildings." It's a fitting epitaph for two souls who discovered that the worst storms sometimes clear the way for the most unexpected blessings, and that finding purpose again after great loss is perhaps the most human miracle of all.